Parshas Behar and Bechukosai often come together, and from the fact that they are often joined means that there's a certain inner connection between them, and this is what the Rebbe wants to understand in this sikha. What is the connection between Behar and Bechukosai? And the Rebbe says we need to understand, when we look at the names of the parsha, which usually represent what the parsha is all about, they actually seem to be representing two opposite ideas. Behar, a mountain, represents a person holding himself high. In Avodah Ruchnis, it of course means the idea that a Yid is acting in a way of Vayigba Libo B'Darkei Hashem, holding himself proud and high, of course, in Avodas Hashem. For example, when it comes to a challenge and a test, he's, as the halacha says, a Yid should be as kanam, bold as a leopard. On the other hand, Bechukosai, which means chukim, represents the idea of humility, bitul. What is the idea of chukim? Hashem says, I gave you a choik, and ein lecha reshus lahadar acharei, and now let us question it. We do it with absolute bitul. So how do these two things, Behar and Bechukosai, come together? Says the Rebbe, in order to understand this, let's first examine a little closer the name Behar itself. Why are we calling the parsha Behar rather than Behar Sinai, or maybe just Sinai? Sinai is really what it's all about. This is the unique mountain on which the Torah was given. Why are we just calling it Behar? The question, says the Rebbe, is even stronger when we actually think about in Avodas Hashem what Har Sinai represents. Chazal tell us the reason why Har Sinai was chosen because it was the lowest mountain, representing the idea of humility on the one hand. On the other hand, it also tells us that it has to be a har, as we just mentioned, that sometimes a Yid has to be proud and strong in his Avodas Hashem, so he should be able to overcome challenges and so on and so forth. People shouldn't be able to be stepping all over him, etc. But obviously, which one of these two things are the most important? The main thing is the idea of humility. At the same time, a person needs to be told not to allow himself to be stepped on, to be a proud Yid and so on. So how does it make sense to call the parsha just by the word Behar and seemingly missing out the main point of Sinai, which is the idea of bittul, humility? Says the Rebbe, one of the explanations is that the avodah of bittul, that the Yid is humble, is of course connected with the fact of the greatness of Hashem. The Yid feels that the only reality is only Elikus, only Hashem. And therefore, says the Rebbe, the real bittul, the real humility, is when the Yid's bittul is to such an extent that he doesn't even feel that he is someone that is being bottled. In other words, it's not like he is an entity, he is a metzias for himself and has to be bottled, but rather he doesn't feel anything outside of Elikus at all. The Rebbe says this is similar to the difference that halacha discusses between a shliach. Although shluchei shel adam kamoised is a tremendous bittul, the shliach is representing it, he's instead of the mishaleach descendant, but he's still something for himself. But then we have an eved. An eved, a slave, is not a metzias for himself at all. He belongs to the master, and everything that he has automatically goes to the master. Says the Rebbe, from this we understand that when a person is holding by the greatest bittul telikus, that he doesn't even feel himself as a metzias at all, then this is not a contradiction to at the same time being holding himself proud and strong and high. Because it's not the pride of his own metzias, of his own entity. Rather, it's what he's representing is the greatness and the strength of Elikus. As Chazal in fact say about an Eved, Eved Melech, Melech, the servant of the king is like the king himself. This is not about giving or not going to give pride and ego to the Eved, because it's not about him. It's what it's representing. He's representing the Melech. It's the king's greatness. Says the Rebbe, that's why this parsha is being called Behar, because we're speaking about the ultimate bittul, that when you have the greatest level of bittul, then the har aspect, when the Yid is holding himself tall and proud, it's in the kind of way that you don't even have to mention the fact that it's a strength of Kedusha that comes along with humility. In other words, the Yid is so bottled telikus that there's no room even to question that there's some metzias of the person by himself. And therefore, we don't have to say that it's Har Sinai, it's just purely Har itself. Says the Rebbe, when we look at the words Har Sinai, these are actually describing, the way we call this mountain is describing different levels in Avodas Hashem. When a Yid is in the beginning of Avodah, at this point we would really actually only call the mountain or the Yid by the name of Sinai. In other words, we don't want to get any har, any greatness, height, pride involved at all, because when the person is still feeling himself somewhat of a metzias, we need to make sure there's not going to be any arrogance and any ego, etc. That's like we say by the shliach, that there could still be, the shliach is still somewhat of a metzias for himself. Then we come, says the Rebbe, to the idea, we call it Har Sinai. So at the first stage we call it just Sinai. Then we call it Har Sinai. In other words, the Yid reached now a deeper level of bittul, that that he could have the greatness and the pride and all of that, because it's not about himself. It's the greatness and the strength of Elikus. But at the same time, we need to keep mentioning that together with the Har, there's Sinai, there's Bittul, to ensure that the person doesn't become a Yesh, doesn't become full of himself, full of ego itself, etc. But, says the Rebbe, then comes the highest level when we're just calling it Behar itself. The Bittul is so perfect that you don't even have to mention Sinai, because there's no thought even, there's no Kasal Kadaita, there's no even room to suspect that there's anything outside of Elikus. Now the Rebbe says there seems to be a very, very high level of Bittul, and yet this is Ayra for every single Yid, because every single Yid is like a mountain. Every single Yid is called Melachim, they're all kings. And that is, when it's being demanded from a Yid that he should have a strength in a matter of Yiddishkeit, it doesn't mean that Chas v'Shalom now we're saying, okay, for a little while, let's forget about your bittul, there's no other choice, we need to protect you from the bad, so you're going to have to act in a strong and proud way. Says the Rebbe, no. Ultimately, every Yid has this strength itself is really coming. It's the strength of his Nefesh Elikis. It's the strength of his Nefesh Elikis, which is truly a part of Hashem. In other words, a Yid has to know that the neshama of a Yid was never chased into Golus. There's no powers in the world that have any power over the Yid in matters of Torah and mitzvahs and Haga Yisrael, etc. No one can give us any opinions. In other words, when it comes to matters of Torah and mitzvahs, the Yid is a melech. And not only has the strength of the king, but as it says, a king, he's not allowed to be moichel on his covet. He's not even allowed to forgive for his honor. Because it's not about his honor, it's the covet of the melech. Is the covet of Melech, Malchei, Amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's in every single Yid. The Yid has a Nefesh Elikis, a godly soul, which is truly a part of Hashem himself. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand the connection between Behar and Bechukosai. Because these two ideas, on the one hand, Behar, the strength that the Yid has, and the pride that the Yid has, and Bechukosai, that absolute bittul, are not in contradiction to each other. One is a result of the other. Because as we discussed, when we speak about the Behar being a result of the absolute and true bittul, that there's no room for even suspecting that there's anything else outside of Hashem. So this idea is very much the same idea as Bechukosai. What's Bechukosai? Bechukosai, in addition to meaning of certain types of mitzvahs that are chukim, the Alter Rebbe explains that Bechukosai is the word of chakika, engraved. What is the idea of an engraved letter? An engraved letter means you have a stone, you have a precious stone, and you have the luchos, and in them there are the letters. There isn't a separate letter. There isn't a separate aleph that's in addition to the stone. What is the aleph? What is the beis? It's just the stone itself is now engraved that the stone is making up this letter. In other words, the same idea that there's a letter, but the letter itself is nothing for itself. There's only the stone. And this is the idea of what chukim are really all about. And the Rebbe says a very interesting thing. It says about chukim, ein lecha reshus laharer achareo. What does ein lecha reshus laharer achareo mean? The Rebbe explains it doesn't mean we're not giving it any thought. We're speaking about a Yid again, like we said, that has all the toikev, he has all the strength, and everything that comes along with it. He has a seichel, he has his midos. So on the one hand, he's using a seichel. At the same time, what he's being told is, as you're using your seichel itself should sort of get that we don't question Hashem's mitzvah. Say, yes, we're going to think about it, we're going to try to understand it to the best of our ability, but it'll never be in a way that we're thinking negatively or thinking that these mitzvahs are in any way less than anything else. Because the Yid, in his chukim, is the same attitude that we said before. The Yid is standing on the one hand with the greatest bittul, like that letter inside the stone. So yes, it is a letter, and he has all of his seichel and his midos, but at the same time, it's only an expression of the stone, or in our case, the Yid is completely bottled to Hashem, so even with all of his strength, the only Metzias is only about Hashem. Says the Rebbe, with this we'll also understand the connection to what's being discussed in most of the Parshas Bechukosai about the reward, or the opposite, for doing mitzvahs or not doing them. Because you might ask, if Bechukosai means doing mitzvahs just because it's Hashem's will, why are we suddenly speaking about reward? That seems to be saying that we're doing mitzvahs having reward in mind. But the Rebbe says no. When a Yid is bottled to the Eibishter in a way of chakika, that there's nothing outside of Hashem, like that letter in the stone, then the reward of the mitzvahs also works in the same way. In other words, the fact that the mitzvahs bring the reward is not causing the Yid to do the mitzvah for the reward, but rather what he feels, again, is only a likus. And therefore, it's obvious, since Hashem is tachlis hatoiv, the ultimate of good, of course, automatically, that also brings good in every single area, both beruchnius and begashmius.